Welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. We are really honored to have on the program the man who will be the first person in modern history in the Ohio legislature to preside over two chambers on the same day. He is Senate President Matt Huffman, who is also Speaker-elect Matt Huffman. Welcome back to the program. We've had a great time over the last year talking with you, and we appreciate you letting us, debut and launch the podcast. But you're going to be presiding over two chambers on the same day. You will become really a major part of Ohio history. What's that like?
Well, I guess for kind of a, as we say, government nerd like me, it's certainly interesting and enjoy that. It's interesting. The statutes say that the former Speaker or President presides over the beginning until there's an election, and it works out that the Senate starts a little bit earlier than the House, so I'll be able to at least bang the gavel and do the initial work in the Senate, and then I'll go over to the House. And I'll get, hopefully, I think I'm going to get elected Speaker, and I'll be able to preside over the second part of that process. So it's neat stuff when you're a history guy like me, especially government history. It's neat to be involved.
Well, we just had your portrait ceremony. And I always enjoyed that. We have the portrait ceremonies from at least the last two Senate presidents that I worked for, Senate President Faber, and who's now state auditor, and of course, former Senate President Larry Obhoff. Your ceremony and your portrait is outstanding. I was very impressed with the portrait. Your thoughts about the portrait and just the ceremony itself. And the portrait comes at a zero taxpayer expense. It's all privately fundraised for the portrait, but the portrait will hang as part of Ohio history there on the Senate chamber outside of the Senate President's office. That must be a humbling experience to see your portrait unveiled.
Yeah, I think like almost everybody, it's the first time I've ever had my portrait. And this happened, and I will tell you, John Barron, our Chief of Staff, did an extraordinary job organizing the day, but also this was about a year-long process with our portrait, with our artist, and she was a delight and very professional. And when you've never been through something before, when you have somebody who can explain it to you, and she did a great job. And It's interesting. I think most people don't know that we didn't start having a Senate president until the late 70s in Ohio. And prior to that, it was, like many states still are, where the lieutenant governor is the presiding officer or vice president of the United States. So I'm actually only the 12th Senate president in the history of the state. We just started having it relatively recently. But they all have their portraits outside the Senate president's office, and it's all, they're all done in whatever unique style they have. So I had some input. The only input I had, I guess, was that I did not want to be the glory shot where you're staring into and she took that and did a marvelous job with it.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the ceremony itself, we have it linked on our On the Record page. Go to ohiosenate.gov, go over to news, click on the Record, and you can find this story along with the full ceremony that we link out to the Ohio channel, but also our video featuring highlights from the ceremony itself. Also, when we think back, when you're in leadership, it's always a heavy lift. You make a lot of friends, and it's a collegial body in many ways, even from both sides of the aisle. We haven't had you on to talk about this yet, but the passing of Senator Kirk Scheuring, good friend of yours, great statesman. You made some wonderful comments during the tribute held in the Senate chamber, and also during his state funeral as he lie in state. He received the honor of lying in state inside the rotunda of the State House. Your memories of Kirk Scheuring?
Well, Kirk's history and professional career spanned a long period of time before he became the number two, the president pro tem here in the Senate in this past General Assembly. He was in the General Assembly since the 90s. I do think that, there are always sort of this picture of what a legislator should be and how they act. Somebody gave me from when we were in the Senate, or excuse me, when I was in the House, I was the majority leader there. We actually had Kirk make a presentation about how to get your bill passed. And it was at a retreat that we had, and somebody gave me his notes, and I referred to those at his ceremony. So in some ways, paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln, there aren't words that I can use that really give him his due. It's 30-year legislative career, doing it because, not just because of a sense of public duty, but because he was really good at it, and he knew he could get bills passed. He knew he could affect people, and he could do it in a pleasant way. Now, it's not that Kirk Scheuring never lost his temper, but if he did, it wasn't the kind of losing of your temper that puts people off, that makes them a permanent enemy or a non-friend, so to speak. But he's also, if you look back, you can see the things that he created that have really a permanent mark, especially when it comes to things like urban revitalization, making sure that the core of our cities, these beautiful buildings in downtowns, are being reused. It's, even though he's a Canton guy, he's large, and I think in many ways a large part of the revitalization of Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus and the downtown areas. So he's missed now. Like all folks, the people who know him eventually will pass too. But his mark on Ohio I think is a permanent one.
Stephanie Kunze, I thought, had really good remarks from the Senate floor that day. She talked about how Senator Scheuring always said that the state needed more statesmen and less statement makers. Who really made a difference in, I guess, guiding you and that you watched as leaders that kind of make you into the leader that you are today? You worked for Bill Batchelder, but even on the local level, when you're the president of Lima City Council, that's really a good indoctrination and experience about, well, how do we get things done to make our community better or to make our state better?
Yeah, I think if you get good at something, it's because you've been doing it a long time and you've made a lot of mistakes, and you say, ooh, I'm not going to do that one anymore. And I think legislating, trying to get consensus. I was on city council in Lima for 15 years. Half of that time I was the president. And if I think about it, I can think I shouldn't have done that, or, oh, that really worked out. And those kind of interactions, certainly, they come from your own personal life, but also, 40 years of practicing law and being part of a law firm in a community, of 20 or 25 people who are seeing each other. All of those things add up. Malcolm Gladwell said, the reason the Beatles were so good isn't just natural talent, but they played like 10,000 shows in Hamburg, Germany, or something like that. The statement is, if you do something 10,000 times, you'll be good at it, no matter what your natural talent is. So, 15 years in city council, 16 years as a legislator, you get a lot better at it. Having said that, I'm still making mistakes. And, so I'll try to get better.
It's always a daily education regardless. As
Right.
we look back during your time as Senate President, from 2021 to today, from 2021, and you'll serve out the remainder of your term December of 2024, you took the oath of office on your front doorstep at the height of COVID, of all things.
Yeah.
And I know there were many of us thinking, oh, this is off to a great start.
Yeah.
Was that what you were thinking?
Well, no, I think I'm a little bit, as I often say, my optimism is often my undoing, but, my view of it was, well, this is just what we have to do today. And, the rest of this is going forward. And if you've done your preparation for whatever endeavor you have, you're ready for things to collapse on you from time to time, and then pick that up and If you wait until the day before the vote on your bill and then you start calling people and saying, why aren't you supporting this? But you haven't spent 6 months working on it, you have less of a chance of winning an election, passing a bill, winning at trial in a lawsuit, whatever the endeavor is. So I guess I looked at that as it's kind of funny for one thing, but it was just, it was a little bump in the road and we moved on.
Well, we also moved on. I think the state and the country, but specifically the state, learned a lot about modern medical technology, health emergencies, and shutting down the state as well. One of the first things that I think it was 2022, maybe late 2021, the Senate led the veto override of Senate Bill 22, which basically gave the legislative branch authority to review emergency health orders. In other words, I think one of the things that we did learn during COVID was that you can't keep people from making a living, because that just creates a desperate environment when people don't have any money and are worried about, how these bills are still coming in, but you're telling me I can't, I can't run my business. What do you think that we learned from that?
Well, I think that's one of the issues. I mean, we lost people out of the workforce. I think this is a repeated story throughout the state. There was in my district, some folks had run a little downtown camera shop for 40 years. And, probably 20 years ago, it was a pretty good business. Probably not such a great business because people are buying things online and et cetera. Well, they were only doing it because it was sort of their life. They'd go to the camera shop, they'd meet people, maybe they'd make a little bit of money. Well, when the pandemic shut them down, they were like, well, we're moving to South Carolina to live with our daughter, which is what she's wanted for a while anyway. So you lost a lot of people like that out of the economy, and that's not good. But I think one of the other things we learned is that because an expert, we got to put that in quotes, says it, that doesn't mean it's not true, or that it's actually true, and we do need to challenge these things. And we're seeing that many of the things that our health experts told us were just flatly wrong. Now, I think it was called the Great Barrington Doctrine. I referenced this in one of my press conferences at the time. This is the Stanford University professor who said, here's why what the CDC is saying is wrong. And when I did that, I mean, the arrows came out, or the daggers came out, and people are like, Huffman, he's telling people that can't possibly be true.
He's a COVID denier.
He's a COVID denier. Well, it turns out that guy was right. And he's going to be part of President Trump's administration. So I think we learn, and even if with these things that we're balancing with the problem with COVID, one of my longtime personal physician, Ed Tremolis, who's an all-around great guy, he was also the doctor for a couple of the local nursing homes. And he called me and said, look, not letting people see their family, these people are dying. So if you're 90 years old or 95 and your whole life day is based on your daughter coming and having lunch with you and you can't do that, he said, there's people dying because of that.
There's no reason to live then.
Yeah.
That's the one thing they look forward to.
Right. And so, we have to balance this, oh my gosh, we can't let this spread, which it was spreading everywhere no matter what anyway, between what are you giving up. Now, Dr. Tremolis can explain the medical part of it, but let's also look on the economy. And fortunately, some of our private schools stood up to the government and said, we're not shutting down. And of course, those kids continued in their education, and unfortunately, many of the public schools that shut down didn't. So,
we're still seeing the ramifications too,
right,
on the public school level of how far children got left behind. Because if you didn't have access to Wi-Fi, or there was no real way to prove that you were actually online doing your work, taking attendance, there were some significant drawbacks and fallbacks in the result category for children from almost every grade level.
Yeah, and even if you did have access to it, and even if you did have a computer that worked all the time, and you had a parent who could help you do that, it's still not the same as a school atmosphere. It's just like, You may say, I'm working from home. Well, you're not as productive if you're not in a building with the other people you work with, where the customers, the constituents can come and see you. So it was in many ways a public policy disaster. Now, some folks can say, well, we learned from it, or we made the best decision. But there were a lot of us saying this is wrong. And when we tried to get the schools to open up, there were a lot of, frankly, the teachers, I say teachers union, it's not really a teachers union anymore. It's
the administrator
It's an
union.
administrators union. Those folks were fighting against opening the schools. So, there are lessons learned. Hopefully we'll remember them, and hopefully we won't have another pandemic.
Well, absolutely. And sticking with you becoming you're the Speaker-elect once it's all official, but you'll be the new Speaker of the House. And of course, it's interesting to see what the editorial boards, who all endorsed State Issue 1, and they lost. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. But here's what your friends at the Cleveland.com podcast were saying about you being the Speaker-elect.
Okay.
And we'll get your reaction.
All right.
Chris Quinn said, we're talking about how Huffman has amassed power. And today on Ohio, he's going to have a near unrivaled control to push his conservative agenda, and that affects millions of people. Matt Huffman really is, the kingmaker. You've got to give Matt Huffman credit for being a pretty brilliant strategist to have pulled this off. He comes from a small town in the middle of nowhere, but you don't do this unless you are really a very good strategist and you've got some brain power. With Matt Huffman moving from the Ohio Senate President's seat to the House Speaker position, he is the most powerful Ohio leader in history, ? Where would he rank? Finally, this guy is the most powerful Ohioan in a long time, even as he's being self-deprecating about it. He has the ability to make this a better state for everybody to live in. Or does he count out a Jerry Serino nonsense to turn college campuses into fascist training centers? And I'm like, oh, here we are. We go. There's, operating in reality for a moment of clarity, and then back to fascist training centers. Yeah. So we can talk about that. But, it's interesting how over your term, especially when you were the incoming Senate president, how you were vilified by many of the editorial boards and commentaries out there. Well, what's your thoughts about the most powerful guy in Ohio, but, he's going to turn college campuses into fascist training centers?
Well, actually, the biggest problem I have with, one of the problems I have with what he said is that somehow somebody from a small town can have influence. I mean,
my favorite place.
Yes,
small town Ohio.
I mean, Dwight Eisenhower's from Abilene, Kansas, and Ronald Reagan was from, I think, Dixon, Illinois, right? And so that's a little bit of nonsense. You must be from the big city in order to be successful. So that's number one. Number two, the thought about a legislator, whether they're speaker or president, being the most powerful person in Ohio. A speaker or president can only act in some very limited circumstances, some appointments and things like that, but can really only act with the consent of their legislative body. And sometimes it's easier to get that if you have a majority and your caucus is largely aligned. But even in that circumstance, you still have to have the other legislative body approve of what you do. And then you have to have a governor who's willing to sign that. And although we did override Governor DeWine's veto on a few things, including his veto of our ability to control the health emergencies, to allow the legislature to have control of that, it's difficult to override a governor's veto because governors don't like that, and they go and they campaign and they talk to members about not doing that. So, as I've said a couple of times, if someone needs to say everybody always wants to say the best baseball player of all time or the best whatever. If somebody has to be the most powerful person, it's always the governor of a state. Besides the veto power, they can issue an executive order, and that's the law right now. Senate president, speaker can't do that. They have thousands of people they appoint things. They can declare emergencies. They can do all sorts of things for people. And so to compare the authority or power, if that's the word you want to use, of any legislator, speaker, president, or otherwise, with a governor, is ridiculous. Now, in terms of my ability to get things done, I know more than the average bear because I've been at it. We talked about it a few minutes ago, because I've been at it for, including city council time, over 30 years now. But the sort of doing that and getting that done are basically the other same basic rules of life. If you have something you want to get done, if the first thing you do is to go punch somebody in the mouth and say, now I'd like a favor out of you, it doesn't work very often. And, I think that most of the ideas I have, not all of them, are within the majority of what Ohioans want to do. The other thing, I try to make this point, people aren't too excited about it, is a lot of the stuff that we do isn't that controversial. It's just the work has to get done. I said yesterday, we made some great reforms in notary public law, which were really important to everyday life, but nobody cares about it, or at least almost nobody cares about it.
It doesn't get the headlines because it's not controversial.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, at any rate, Senate Bill 83 is a great bill. Jerry Serino, great legislator. The work that he did to try to get it changed in the House, and I'll have to compliment Tom Young, who's an excellent legislator. It's going to come back in the next General Assembly, and hopefully our university culture and participants will see that they should be partners in how we're going to reform.
Well, both you and Senator Serino made some significant inroads by hosting 2 Ohio Public University trustee symposiums inside the atrium of the Ohio State House, where it was really reinforced to the trustees that the faculty is not in charge of the university. The president is not in charge of the university. You are. The trustees are in charge of the university. Yeah. Do you think that was an important message to get across?
I part of what we had coming into this discussion that Jerry has led in the Senate, at least, and Tom in the House, is a lot of the trustees looking and saying, well, yeah, I'm a trustee, but, I go to a meeting, they give me an 1,100-page document, and they say, we'll be voting in 1 hour. Well, if you're on the board of a local bank or some corporation and suddenly things go bad, people are going to point at you and say, you were at the meetings, you were on the board, what did you do? And, and that happens all the time in private life. It doesn't happen in universities, especially public universities, because there's always a constant supply of money. So we want trustees who take the job seriously, who feel like they have authority to affect policy, and then give the president the authority to move that policy forward and do their job. It cannot be up to the employees to decide what the president and what the board does. It never works at any level. Now, we have great working relationships, and it waxes and wanes often in the private sector, the UAW and Ford, and they have their fights and they go back and forth. But the UAW doesn't say, here's what we're going to do, or we're shutting the place down. Now, they can go on strike and they have all of their arguments, and, steel workers at refineries and whoever it is. But, we saw recently in the Cincinnati Public Schools that the employees voted no confidence to the superintendent. The local school board didn't back the superintendent. She packed up her stuff and left. You're not going to get reform of the institution as long as the employees are saying, we're in charge. It just doesn't happen.
One of the major accomplishments, I think, and we'll talk about a couple of them during your time as Senate President, was the reform of the Department of Education into the Department of Education and Workforce. And I was having this conversation with somebody just last week who was asking about the state school board, and I said, well, there's been a significant reform about their duties because under the old system, the school board was really unaccountable, and the Department of Education was not accountable, rather, to any branch of government, and that is no longer the case. How big of a victory and how big of a game changer was the reforming of the duties of the Department of Education and combining it with the workforce?
Well, I think it's that single change is the biggest, most important thing that's happened during the 4 years that I was president of the Senate. And most Ohioans didn't know, and frankly, I didn't know when I came in the legislature, that there's a constitutional provision that says there is a state school board, and what the state school board will deal with will be determined by law. And of course, the legislature makes the law. For 30 or 40 years, we had a state school board who essentially their view of the world was, let me say this first. The state school board, the members, they don't have any staff. They essentially work for free. And if we had that in the legislature, if I didn't have all these folks who could come and say, how are we going to get things done, the legislature wouldn't be doing it. And so we'd have no control over the bureaucracy and how we spend money. So that was never going to change unless the state school board said, we're now going to hire our own people to decide what you're going to do or to help us make decisions. So there was, and we talked about that for years, and essentially now what we have is a Department of Education that is accountable to the legislature, that when the Senate president calls and says, hey, I'd like to meet with your folks about this issue, they don't say, we don't have time this month.
Didn't they actually tell you one time that we don't work for you?
Yeah. Their legislative liaison, when I brought these issues up, he looked at me and said, we don't have to do anything you say. We don't work for the legislature. And you know what? He was absolutely right. And that's why we had to change it. So a lot of the folks are still in that department. A lot of folks said, well, I don't want to have to talk to legislators, and they've left. But we talk about a lot of things in K-12 education. The vast number of our school districts are run great. They're well-funded. They're in great shape. Largely our major urban school districts, it's a tragedy what has been going on for the last 20 years. And we can't simply say, well, if they had a little bit more money and we paid the same people to do the same thing, maybe we'll get a different result. There must be a substantial change in what we do. And I think that's the attitude of many of the new folks in the department, and certainly among a lot of legislators. So I'm optimistic about it.
We had Education Chair Senator Brenner on, and we talked about the cash carryover numbers of some of the major urban districts, like City of Columbus, that just passed another levy that adds to your property taxes. And that's also another story that we can talk about. Upwards of 275, I believe even $300 million forecast one of their years of the 5-year forecast, which estimates what their on-hand cash carryover would be. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of money to have on hand. Obviously, if you're running a school system or a private business, you want to have some cash on hand, but you're talking about multiples of what your normal operating budget is here. And all we hear then from the Coalition of Equity and Adequacy that is challenging the Ed Choice Scholarship Program is schools just don't have enough money. Really, it seems like many of these schools have more than enough money.
Yeah, I think arguments where you use the best case to make your case, and one of the cases is, well, look at such and such school district, and they've got this financial problem. Okay, we should do something about that, but the answer is give everybody lots more money, because these guys are sitting on 150, 200% of what their actual budget is. Most private businesses, a CPA will tell you, like mine, you should have 3 months cash carryover on hand all of the time. And run your operations and things like that. And certainly public school districts are less flexible than private businesses. Part of the problem is that the mandates that private schools or their employees have insisted we put on them about who can work there and how much they have to be paid, that's part of the problem. But it's what we have to say, or what we have to understand is not all public school districts are alike. When we try to have a formulas, which we know right now, formulas don't work. And there are probably a third of our school districts where we can simply say, you know what, you don't have to do all of this stuff, because every year almost all your kids graduate, they all pass the test, they all show up for school, the attendance rate is 98%. Why is the state bothering them? Let them go do their thing, and if they continue to do that, then we have absolute disasters like the Cincinnati Public Schools. that needs to change. It needs to be taken apart. There needs to be a completely different overhaul. And part of it is the cash that these folks are sitting on top of, which belong in the taxpayer's pocket. Okay, and by the way, we have the income tax refund. We've had that for 20 years in state. We got rid of that, and we now have that if agencies in the state have extra money, it goes into the sales tax holiday every year. So the state's checking account is not where your money should be. It should be in your checking account.
Right. We believe that it's your money first, not the government's money. The expansion of Ed Choice scholarships, of course, has generated a lot of controversy. Parents love it. Hugely successful program. In fact, I love the question that you received from the reporter gaggle after a session this past week, or no, maybe it was during one of the special shows that we did about, wow, the cost of this program surged past what was originally estimated, and your answer was, well, it actually saves the state money, because when the average per pupil cost is more than $14,000 K through 12, an Ed Choice scholarship, which is available to every family on a sliding scale based on income, actually saves the state money. And believe it or not, parents get a say in where their kids go to school.
Yeah. I mean, there's really two sort of columns that this rests on. One is that people do have an opportunity to take their children where there is some actual choice to the school that they want. And we say parents, but often many of these children don't have parents, or they live with a grandmother, or they live with relatives or foster children. And so where there is choice, which there isn't choice everywhere, they have an opportunity to do that. But the other part to that is, on average, and we're going to take the autism and John Peterson scholarships out of this. Those are much higher cost, but on average, these other three programs, it's about $7,000, because the K-8's lower than the high school. So that's about half the cost. So we can look at taxpayers and say, the more children that we have enrolled in this globally, statewide, the more money the taxpayer is saving. It's about half the cost. Now, I would argue that the savings is much greater than that, because many of the folks who are taking these Ed Choice scholarships are in high-cost urban districts. So in Youngstown, Ohio, where the average cost is now exceeding $30,000, where that child is taking a $7,000, it's saving almost more than 4 times the cost of the public school education. And in fact, we say average $14,000. That's because in places like West Central Ohio that I represent, the cost is much lower. And also in many of those small towns, the people love their local public school. And also there's not a private school in the small town. So if you go to Coldwater, Ohio, or Minster, or Russia, and places like that, everybody likes the school. They get great academic results, but the cost is less than the statewide average. Well, why are we going to mess with that? The problem, it's not exclusively, but the problem is in these large urban districts where the cost is high, the results are poor, and in many cases there's no place for the kids to go. And part of it is because other public school districts that surround these urban districts won't allow open enrollment into their district. And so in a sense, you've got people who are trapped, and the opportunity to say, let's go to this private school. I get the political part, I get the money part, but how folks can actually argue against that child getting a better education, it's hard to see that.
Well, they're making parents the enemy. They're vilifying parents, and that is a no-win type of narrative and strategy for the opponents of that program. And by the way, that money that goes into the Ed Choice scholarship does not come from the local school system. It's directly funded by the state.
Right, and because that was essentially a talking point. Well, we got this money, we're not educating the child, so we had to send a check over to this. Well, okay, it's actually not your money. This is the taxpayers' money, which you're given to educate people. And so we changed that. Well, that hasn't changed the attempts for people to shut these programs down. This discussion will never end as long as people believe that the buildings and the money are about the people who work there. When private businesses say we need to make sure that everybody's happy, maybe the customer's happy, maybe they're not. And, those are businesses that fail. Now, you do have to have happy employees, and, I want my employees to be happy, and if clients and customers act inappropriately, there's problems with that. But these are public service agencies, schools, whatever else we're doing here in Columbus. They are not here for the benefit of the people who work there. We hope they're happy. We want them to be paid appropriately, and they are. They have wonderful benefits, all of those things. But this has to focus on happy customers.
Moving ahead to the next year as well, we have the new operating budget, always a heavy lift. The transportation budget is also part of the first year of the new 136th General Assembly. We have seen the reduction of tax brackets from 9 down to 2. Do you think there will be further discussion about flat tax or just about tax policy in general? Obviously, the operating budget is what funds your state services.
Yeah, I definitely do, especially regarding real estate taxes. And you cannot separate increasing real estate taxes from where that money is going. And largely it's going to public schools. Most districts are somewhere between 70 and 80% of your tax dollar will be going to your local public school. The enormous increase, in the first 20 years of this century, we had a 50% increase in spending in public schools. That's adjusted for inflation, by the way. And then in the last 2 budgets, we've had record increases. And of course, the answer for many is we're desperate. We don't have enough money. And so we have to address that we're not going to get property tax reform. We're not going to get revenue reform if we don't have spending reform. And I also ask people to take a step back and talk about what taxes we have, why people pay them, and to help determine fairness. In some ways, you can control what your income tax is by the income that you make. And some folks, I've had high-income people say, hey, look, once I get to a certain number, back when in the old tax bracket, it used to be 92% for the feds, they'd say, I get to a certain tax bracket, I'm going on vacation the rest of the year because otherwise I'm just working for the government. And if you live in New York City where it's an over 50%, 55% income after you get done with the federal, state, and local, people saying, so you lose that productivity. But largely people say, well, the harder I work, the more I make, the more I pay. That's what income tax is. But you know that. The same is true with sales tax. The sales tax is going to be part of my ability to decide whether I want to buy something, the extra that's set on there. Same with excise taxes on alcohol and gas and cigarettes, things like that. The real estate taxes, however, are not within your control. You buy a house, and some other person is going to say what the valuation is from year to year. You don't get, because the mantra often is, well, if you think my house is worth that, I'll sell it to you right now, right? People say that to you all the time. So someone else determines the valuation. The public decides what the levy is that goes on, whether it's schools or some of these other taxes.
Libraries, do you name it?
Library,
bus, transportation.
Yeah, whatever it is, and it changes in every district. So it's out of your control, and you don't get to decide, well, you know what? I'm just not going to drive as much because they've added on a tax onto the gas and I can't afford that. I'll buy a smaller car, I'll move closer to work or whatever it is. So it's out of the control, and I think that's one of the things that really frustrates people, especially people who bought a house 40 years ago and they live in the country and all of a sudden it's a hot commodity and you've retired and you've got your retirement income. Well, all of a sudden your taxes have tripled or quadrupled in the course of 3 years. And that was money you were going to use to go on vacation or, pay for medical bills, and all of a sudden it just goes out. So it's extraordinarily frustrating from that perspective. The perspective we just talked about how public agencies are sitting on hundreds of millions, actually I think the total statewide number is $9 billion that school districts have on hand. So we really need to consider how it is we're going to move real estate tax. I think we need to take the whole thing apart. But we have to have the courage to understand that there are going to be extraordinarily angry people who are saying, well, we're getting less money. Yeah, that's true. And in places where, essentially the school is going to shut down or they can't function, we have to take that into account. All of these are going to be similarly, they're not all going to be treated the same. They're not all going to be similarly affected. The little stopgap measures that have been put in place through the years have only exacerbated the problem. And but yeah, there's going to be yelling and gnashing of teeth as always. And this is a little bit, John, like the discussion we had about local pay salaries that we talked about over the last 2 weeks or so. Well, longer than that, several weeks. When we start talking about this, there is a lot of reform that needs to happen at the local government level. But one of our statutes says that in a couple of these elected positions, they're only required to be in the office 1 day out of every 90 days. Well, I don't think most people argue or think that's fair. They can't do that at their job. And when we talk to people about reforms, there's this automatic, I'm outraged that you would even ask that. I work hard. I'm in the office every day. Okay, let's just change the statute. No go. And so people want more money, but they don't want to talk about, and Ohio is a very high tax state at the local level. The state taxes are low. If you separate those out, we're not a high tax state. But because of the number of local jurisdictions, thousands of them, I think we have 10 or 12 times as many as the state of New York, for example. It's very difficult to get reform. And, that's why I'm not prepared to have a conversation with local elected officials until they're prepared to have a conversation about bloat and extra cost and things like that. So, and we have the same thing, I think, in school taxes also.
Yeah, and you put your finger on it. Low state taxes, very enticing to come to the state of Ohio based on the state tax structure, but very high local taxes. Right. And that certainly is a problem, and I appreciate your input on that. We had lame duck last couple of weeks, finished up the very last session of the 135th General Assembly. Lame duck, always an interesting title about, sometimes it can be lame, sometimes it's pretty interesting. But one of the things that was addressed was something called House Bill 8 and Senate Bill 293, which was Senator Michelle Reynolds' bill that basically established a foundational parent's right to know what goes on in their child's classroom, because there does seem to be an effort or a group think from the left that when you drop your child off at school, now they're the parents. Well, wrong. And what House Bill 8 did, it addressed religious release times for religious instruction during the school day, things like Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and it became a pretty good debate about that. You supported House Bill 8 and Senate Bill 293. Good, solid foundational legislation, do you think, for parents and students?
So we need to back up. The United States Supreme Court said a long time ago, this was a case out of New York where kids were going to go and go to mass at a local school, and local school districts said, we're not going to let you do that. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that a local public school is required to allow this. They have to do it, okay? So what happens when you have a constitutional right for something, but your government, your local government in this case, won't allow that? And, what you can do is go file a lawsuit with these folks. So that's basically not practical. You can get a federal judge to say, okay, here are the parameters. We don't want federal judges telling us how we should do this. So when this was first passed, one of the things that happens is, the folks from public school lobbyists will come in and say, well, yeah, we all for this, we're all going to do it, but can you say may instead of shall? Because, that way we have some flexibility about it. And, in spirit of compromise, people say, okay, let's say, well, what happened is many of these things were very successful, and a lot of parents wanted to do it. And what happened was, in this particular case, the Westerville School District suddenly said, we're stopping this. We're not going to allow religious release time. And of course, that's in violation of the United States Constitution. Your public school education does not supersede your right to exercise your religion freely. And so what we had to say was, look, you have to have a policy for this.
Just a policy.
Yeah, you
not
decide
saying a program.
Yeah,
just a policy.
You shall have a policy instead of you may have a policy. You make up what the policy is, and if you want to talk about background checks and when it happens and all of that, that all changes. Now, the opponents of House Bill 8 say, well, most people do this anyway. Well, sure, I keep talking about Coldwater, but Kalida, Ohio, the kids get out of school early on holy days of obligation to go to Mass. Great. But what if you're in Westerville, Ohio, and they say, we're not going to let you do this anymore? So, well, now we have lawsuits, we have people, and it's like, have a policy. You decide what it is. And we hope that that's accommodating. But I agree with folks, as is certainly my wife and I's philosophy, it's our obligation to have a religious education for our children, but it's also our obligation to have any education for the children. All the public school is what the community has come together and said, we're going to pay our taxes and have a school. It doesn't, the parents' involvement doesn't end, as you say, as the child walks in the door. And so that's a problem typically with the mindset. We've had, of course, some egregious overstepping by some folks in there, some of the things they're taught, especially to younger kids. It's outrageous, frankly. So I think this has sort of been a good lesson in let's be flexible, let's allow these things to go forward, and I think we ended up with a good result. The bill was tailored, and it gives Senator Brenner, Chairman Brenner, all the credit in the world because he's a much more patient legislator than he was 12 years ago. He's really grown and gotten better. So he worked through this thing tirelessly for several months, and we got a good result.
Final topic, and it was a big win for not only democracy in Ohio in November, but to protect the voice of the voter, and that was the 8-point defeat of State Issue 1. Moving into the new year in the 136th General Assembly, there will be a new congressional map drawn under Article 19, which is the process that 75% of the voters passed unanimously, almost 75% in a state issue. It was huge, basically establishing the guidelines for drawing the congressional map. That process begins with the General Assembly, then it would go to the Redistricting Commission, and then back to the General Assembly, but it does require the bipartisan input and compact communities of interest. Your thoughts about how that will be approached and the overall process of drawing a new congressional map?
Yeah, and I talk about that, but just real quick on Issue 1, the point needs to be made that there have been a variety of redistricting proposed reforms going back to the 60s. The Republicans put something on the ballot because the Democrats were in charge. That was defeated. Then they got together and in the late 60s put one on together and it passed, right? And Republicans tried again in the 80s and that failed. And when Republicans took over statewide offices in the 2000s, well, the Democrats tried in 2005, failed, tried in 2012, failed. Then we got together again in 15 and 18 and passed two because we said, okay, we're going to do all these reforms and everything. And then, of course, this latest, which I wouldn't even, it's not really even an Ohio Democratic Party. This was run out of Washington. You look at where the dollars came from.
40 million,
yeah.
I think it'll be.
Yeah, I think
more than 40 million.
I think the public dollars we now know are $43 million spent and about $8 million on the No campaign. So the clear message here is you can have, and I think probably 90% of the media coverage was on the other side, and that's not counting, as they say, the dark money spent on the yes side. But the clear message here is you can outspend the other side 5-1, but if it's not bipartisan in Ohio, it's not going to pass. And so if there are other changes or tweaks, as we've talked about those things, I'm all ears. But on the current process that we have, again, these were things that were negotiated back in 2017 or 18. Minority didn't feel like they had enough input, so that's part of it. But the other part is, and I think from my standpoint, the important part, are the specific requirements so that you don't have elongated districts, you don't split up communities. All of those things, in some instance, restrict the ability of the majority to do what they want. But there are also really good government things, and typically these fights are really intra-party. This Republican congressman wants that, and the incoming guy, we don't care whether he'll lose his next election. And so it's a great big puzzle. So if we're able to come up with a bipartisan support, I think it's 60%, we'll have a map in September. If not, the Redistricting Commission has a shot at it in October, maybe, maybe not. If not, then the majority party, 50% plus one, will have a map in November. So that will be the map for the 26, 28, and 2030 elections. We'll have a process. We got other things to do before we get to that. We've got budgets and a lot of pending legislation. But the good news is we don't have to wait for the census to come back in the middle of a pandemic. We have all that information now, and we'll probably start in earnest in that in July and August.
It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast over the last year and watching your 4 years as Ohio Senate President, and we look forward to having you back on when you are Speaker of the Ohio House. Maybe we'll have to rebrand the podcast. We'll call it the OGMC, the Ohio General Assembly Majority Caucus Podcast, and broaden the footprint even more.
Yeah, well, I would say this, John. I mean, I don't think many people see what you and your team have done in terms of this kind of presentation. And I know at the beginning there was, people were pounding on the table saying they're using taxpayer dollars to communicate with the public. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, when I first started in the House, it's like, get your newsletters out and make sure you do your public service announcements and do a number of things. We have a mail budget where you can mail things to your constituents. The difference here is this is a modern way of communicating, and we're knifing right through the middle of what, many of the messages that are in the media. And of course, as we've seen in the recent election, this is how the public, in the public, want to get their messages through these unedited video. Even the things that, when I do speak on video, and I get it, they only have so much time on TV or radio, or they only have as much room as they want in the newspaper. But people can see this and they can say, well, he did say that, but here's all the other things that he said on it. So I think this is what you have done and your team have done are revolutionary in many regards, and I think it's something that we should try to continue into the future.
Oh, thank you. We really appreciate, again, the opportunity to do that. We like communicating with our audience, providing relevant content to you, our audience, on a modern technology platform, and we'll continue to do so. Absolutely. Best of luck to you. Thanks, as always, for your time. We wish you a very happy and successful new year in the 136th General Assembly.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, John.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.